Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101. This is technically day 23 of the series of mini episodes as part of the Challenging Times Self-Care Challenge. My name is Mio Yokoi. I work as a registered psychotherapist in Toronto, Canada, and also as a coach and supporter to striving, highly sensitive folks everywhere. Before we begin, I'd like to make sure to mention that what I share on this podcast is for general information purposes only and not meant to be specific advice. And for personalized help, questions, or concerns you may have, please consult your doctor or appropriate medical or mental health care provider. Again, welcome to day 23 of the Challenging Times Self-Care Challenge. So it's been a while since I've released a self-care challenge episode. Actually, it's been a while since I've been consistent with this podcast overall. I guess the way things have been for me is this. It's been a hard time. I've had a hard time going on as though things are as business as usual because it hasn't been, clearly, I don't think, for any of us. The pandemic is still a thing, even though as things in our worlds have begun to open back up and there's more of an ability to move around and do things as we're more used to being able to do. But the threat of a viral infection, illness, and the spread is still real. And while our experiences are not so much about restrictions and lockdowns as it may have been a few months ago, there's still so many unexpected and uncertain things we are managing and dealing with all the time. As big and overwhelming the pandemic has been for us, the forefront of racial injustice and police brutality, with George Floyd's murder on May 25th as yet another occurrence of an example of those things and the realities of life lived with systemic injustice, as racialized folks have been in the forefront of our collective consciousness now. I mention all of this not because I have any answers, and I certainly don't, but because I think it's crucial to acknowledge that living with stress and trauma is not just a mental and emotional experience, it's also a physical and a bodily one as well. There's so much in the world and in our individual lives to think about and to be feeling right now, and by feeling internally and also physically. And prioritizing ourselves and our mental health, I think more than ever, is so crucial. Of course, these self-care podcast episodes that I've been producing, as I'd already mentioned, are not meant to be a substitute for professional support. But if you are in need of it right now, please do take the time to perhaps research your options and know that there are a lot of resources that are available to you. But do know that taking time, reflecting, and knowing that taking care of yourself means that you'll be able to best do and give of yourself in the ways that are most important to you. I've often heard folks say things like, I'm not feeling stressed, I don't get stressed, or I don't think anything's bothering me right now. But most of us haven't been taught to be able to recognize what stress, distress, or trauma feels like physically, mentally, and emotionally. And especially when we have a global evidence right now of things that are out of order, that feels disordered, and there's so much unrest, there definitely is some level of stress and perhaps even trauma that many of us are experiencing. And for us to be able to go, well, I'm not feeling it, I'm not consciously feeling it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. And I think this is something important to keep in mind when it comes to our mental health, because things may be having such an impact on us psychologically, emotionally, and physically. And when they do, they are impacting our mental health. And when things impact our mental health, it is impacting us, our health overall, impacting who we are overall. And not only that, when things are impacting our mental health and when we don't take care of ourselves, there's often an accumulating factor. So in other words, you know that saying, the straw that broke the camel's back. Well, everything that we experience emotionally and mentally is like those individual straws piling up. And without making the effort to clean up each one of those straws, or to deal at least with each one of those straws, they will eventually accumulate to the point where that proverbial last straw ends up becoming that one straw too many. And it's with this in mind that I've been recording these self-care episodes as imperfectly as I've been. But there are a lot of different ways, and maybe even a combination of ways to engage in self-care, which can help to manage these straws or experiences that may be accumulating for all of us. Which is why there can be so many of these self-care prompt episodes. They can all be helpful, but some might resonate more personally for you than it might be for others. But the thing that I think is important for every one of us to think about in one way or another is to think about incorporating the need for movement. Now, many people, I think when they think about movement, will think about, and to some extent, like rightly, to utilize exercise to help to manage stress. And if that's something that works for you, whatever it might be for you. So it could be running, it could be aerobic exercises, strength training, yoga, combination of all those things. They are all super helpful for your overall health. So that's really great if you have certain things like exercises or certain movement practices that work for you. That's really fantastic. The suggestions I have today might be a little less common, but something that could be useful, specifically when dealing with stress and possibly also trauma. So in the US, there are stats, and I'd imagine, and this would be true in other parts of the world as well, just speculative, but I imagine it would likely be true, that stress is one of the most common reasons as to why people consult with their primary care physician. And while many of us only start to acknowledge stress when there are manifestations of physical symptoms, and even when that happens, many people may not even realize that there are manifestations of stress. Stress definitely also has mental and emotional health implications too. Part of maintaining and sustaining mental health is through movement. When I was in the process of training to become a therapist, I worked with a supervisor who also had knowledge of Indigenous healing practices. And I distinctly remember in one of my supervisory sessions with her, she mentioned to me that there are natural ways of discharging and healing emotionally. And one of them is shaking. Since then, I'd always been interested in the practice of shaking to release and to heal. And while I'm not at all educated nor trained in Indigenous healing practices, there have been many studies that have been conducted on what has also been termed therapeutic tremoring to shake off stress and trauma. It's believed that shaking can have a calming effect by releasing built-up tension from the central nervous system and muscles. Over the years, the 3 ways I've personally incorporated shaking is, number 1, the use of a body vibration machine. I'll admit it's a bit of an investment, and it takes a pretty decent physical footprint in our small downtown place, but 10 minutes of shaking on the machine, and I do find that it's really great for stress relief. Secondly, I also use a rebounder or a mini trampoline, which maybe doesn't exactly fit into the area of shaking per se, but bouncing is a full body activation activity. and it's known to stimulate the lymphatic system as well as releasing endorphins, oxygenates the body, promotes cell growth and repair, amongst many other cited benefits. And third, when it comes to shaking, I've had some experience with the trauma or tension release exercises, and they're generally kind of abbreviated as TRE. So trauma or tension release exercises, otherwise known as TRE, which is a series of exercises to promote therapeutic shaking, which is meant to release tensions, stress, and trauma held in the body. There are specifically trained practitioners who teach and work with people in TRE, but the exercises are also meant to be accessible and safe to learn from a number of resources, including those available at the TRE website, which is traumaprevention.com. And there are also a good number of videos on YouTube. So by watching those videos, you would be able to perhaps learn them for yourself and maybe to be able to do them at home. In addition to shaking, I also wanted to suggest an exercise mentioned by therapist Resmaa Menakem and author of My Grandmother's Hands, who speaks to racialized trauma on a recent episode of the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett. Rather than for me to describe the movement practice Resmaa details, there's a shortened version of the longer On Being podcast, which is entitled Race and Healing, a Body Practice. But I'd also encourage you to listen actually to the full length episode featuring an interview with Resmaa on Being called Notice the Rage, Notice the Silence. And what is fascinating about that particular interview, I find, is that he is a therapist that is, he works out of Minneapolis. And I believe that Krista Tippett is as well. So this was all recorded before the police brutality incident with George Floyd happened, and my understanding is that it also happened before the pandemic because both Resmaa and Krista were both in the same room as they had this conversation. So it turns out that they had this incredibly powerful conversation at such a time where being able to hear it now is so powerful. And it's such a learning experience, at least it has been for me. So I hope you do check it out. Of course, all the resources I have mentioned in this episode will be included in the show notes. So movement for our mental and emotional health during this time of increased stress and trauma is important to our overall well-being. So I hope you please consider checking out these resources or make sure to prioritize movement, whatever your movement of choice may be, as a regular self-care practice. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, please stay safe and in good health wherever you are in the world. And I look forward to speaking to you again real soon.